Hello, welcome to the forum. My name is Dan Goodman, and my partner here is Soo Jung Hyun. Both of us are students at Harvard University, and on behalf of the Projects Committee at the Institute of Politics, we would like to welcome you all and thank the Forum Office and the Institute of Politics for being supportive and allowing this forum to happen, which took a very long time to put together, and we're really happy that so many people turned out. So, with that, I'll turn it over to my co-organizer. Thanks.
Welcome. I see many familiar faces. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank a few student groups who helped us, who helped co-sponsor this event. They're the Harvard Radcliffe Undergraduate Council, the Asian American Association, Harvard College Democrats, Radcliffe Union of Students, Democratic Socialists of America, the Anthropology Club, and we had the cooperation of Harvard Radcliffe Amnesty International. And also some off-campus groups, the East Timor Action Network, the Portuguese American, the Portuguese Continental Union, and the Human Rights Program at the Harvard Law School. Thank you all very, very much. And I'll turn you over to Professor Henry Steiner, who will be moderating for us this evening.
Good evening. I'm pleased, as I'm certain the panelists are, to find so many people interested in East Timor. One doesn't know whether to say the case of East Timor, the problem of East Timor, the agony of East Timor. It has been all of those things for a large number of years, featuring importantly in the discourse and writings about international human rights, but very little understood. I compliment those who put this panel and this event together, a chance to clarify what is meant by the problem of East Timor in what is for us a remote and not very well known part of the world, for us who live primarily here. Let me spend my very few moments, we have a long program tonight, just giving you, those of you to whom East Timor is not as identifiable as Framingham or whatever, some bearing in time or space about what our panelists tonight will be talking about. The space puts us into an area between the Malaysian Peninsula and Australia. The island of Timor is located north of Australia and southeast of the Malaysian Peninsula on the more or less eastern fringe of the Indonesian islands. I shall give you a very detailed and perceptive history of that area from the 17th century to the present in about 45 seconds. During the age of colonialism, two powers landed on the island of Timor. We all know about the Dutch. Their sway reached well beyond the island of Timor to most of what later became the independent country of Indonesia. The Portuguese settled on East Timor, the eastern side of the island, with a little bit of the western side of the island too. The Portuguese language figures importantly in Timor history and culture. The religion is largely Catholic. The Portuguese imprint is clearly present. In the post-war period, when Indonesia asserted its independence in 45 and when it was finally granted and acknowledged by all parties involved, including the Netherlands, in 49, the island then became split, with West Timor, what had been a Dutch colony, becoming part of the new Indonesia, with East Timor remaining part of the Portuguese Empire. A decade and a half later, several decades later, in the, I guess a decade and a half, in the mid-60s, with the Portuguese mid-70s, the Portuguese Revolution, internally, the taking of power by the military and the overthrow of the old regime, much of the Portuguese Empire dissolved with great speed. This took place particularly with respect to the major African colonies. Timor was more out of sight than Mozambique or Angola during that period, and a series of political events and formations took place with an expectable spectrum of political opinions and a variety of solutions about the status of East Timor, linked in some way to Portugal, linked in some way to Indonesia, totally independent, and so on. In this posture, with a great deal of ferment that probably our speakers will comment on, perhaps to some extent a bit more, Indonesia invaded the eastern part of the island in 1975, and what was meant to be a rather quick operation to absorb East Timor into the state of Indonesia. That absorption has taken place in the sense that a military occupation has continued on East Timor to the present. It has not taken place in terms of the quelling of resistance or the acknowledgement by the people of East Timor that they wish to be part of the state of Indonesia. Through this period, politics remained complex, fighting went up and down. There were a continuing period of military repression, anguish. The estimates in terms of those killed run at least to 60,000. The estimates of those whose lives were lost due to this occupation run from 100,000 to 200,000 when one takes into account displacement, starvation, and other phenomena accompanying a severe military occupation, repression, and guerrilla resistance. Throughout this period, then, there was more or less a stalemate. The United Nations passed resolutions, the General Assembly, urging Indonesia to leave in the 70s and into the early 80s. It has been relatively quiet until the present. Since that time, the attitudes politically of other countries have varied. One country, Australia, has de jure recognized the absorption of East Timor into Indonesia. The United States and several other countries de facto have accepted this absorption. Okay, so much for this very quick background, which speakers may draw on in their own talks. Before I introduce the speakers, we're going to start with a very brief video display from some CBS shots. So if everything is ready, perhaps we can let that roll.
Confusion around President Bush about quotas, anti-discrimination policies, and a new civil rights bill. New evidence that Americans are worried sick about their families and making ends meet. Also, a CBS News exclusive, photographs of a bloody massacre during a fight for freedom. This is the CBS Evening News. Good evening, Dan Rather reporting. A killing ground in a remote area of the Far East is just beginning to get the world's attention. That is because Western reporters were inside Indonesia when soldiers opened fire on a group of civilians. It happened last week in East Timor, a former Portuguese colony where up to 200,000 people have died from massacres and famine over the last 16 years. Barry Peterson narrates a report.
It all began with a prayer. Catholic Mass for a student killed in a demonstration against the forced rule of Muslim Indonesia. East Timor was seized in 1975 by Indonesian leaders, fearful that the spirit of independence might spread to other Indonesian-ruled islands. America accepted Indonesia's takeover. The United Nations did not. On this day, protesters, including women and children, challenged the military by marching to a nearby cemetery. Suddenly, and without provocation, say Western reporters, the street became a killing field.
The soldiers issued no warning. They simply rounded the corner in formation and opened fire on the crowd, mowing people down with their M16s.
Fleeing into the cemetery offered the only hope of escaping the massacre. These pictures, seen tonight for the first time in America, have sparked outrage in Europe and calls for an investigation by the United Nations. Foreign intervention, say those in East Timor, is our only hope. Indonesia wants to avoid that. It's an internal affair, insisted one military official today. After this day's internal affair, Indonesian soldiers searched for survivors, beating and then arresting them. Perhaps 100 were gunned down, 300 wounded. This young man was among those badly hurt but unable to get any medical care. He died moments later. There is nothing new about this kind of killing, say those in East Timor, just that this time there was someone here to see it. Barry Peterson, CBS News, London.
Still to come on the CBS Evening News. U.S. troops will stay in South Korea to face down a nuclear threat from North Korea. And a Frenchman goes over the ocean waves and into the record book.
Two of the panelists here tonight, the formal subject of tonight deals with this November massacre of last year, but obviously must implicate the larger question of U.S. foreign policy, politically and economically, toward Indonesia with respect to East Timor. Two of our guests were the two eyewitnesses referred to, the two American eyewitnesses, at this event in November. And they will lead off proceedings, expanding on what you've seen on film here. The first will be Amy Goodman, who is news editor for WBAI Pacifica Radio. And the second will be Allan Nairn, correspondent with the New Yorker magazine. I think I will continue and introduce the remaining speakers as well, so they can immediately proceed in order. The third speaker will be Benedict Anderson, a professor of international studies and director of the Modern Indonesia program at Cornell University, a distinguished author in the social sciences and social theory. The fourth speaker will be Larry Dinger, the Indonesia Desk Officer in the Department of State, who became desk officer after having served for a period of time in the political office in Jakarta. And the final speaker will be Noam Chomsky, the professor in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT, and one who expresses himself with regularity and force on numbers of issues, including human rights issues. So we have an excellent forum. If it ranges from the State Department to Professor Chomsky, I think no one can accuse this particular panel of lacking diversity. We'll try to hold our talks to a relatively brief period of time, since they are 5 and I've already taken up some time, to leave room for you with questions. So please stick around. I assure you it will be worth it. Our first speaker, Ms. Goodman.
Big countries with powerful military machines should not be permitted to invade, occupy, and brutalize their peaceful neighbors. These were the words of U.S. Secretary of State James Baker last year, explaining why the United States went to war with Iraq. Well, 16 years ago, another large country, Indonesia, invaded a much smaller one, East Timor, with the support and blessing of the United States. For the next 16 years, or for at least the next decade, they closed the country to the world, and what followed was one of the greatest genocides in the 20th century. More than a third of the population was killed. Proportionately, that's larger than Pol Pot's genocide in Cambodia. About 200,000 people were killed. Just before the invasion, December 7th, 1975, a team of Australian and British journalists, 5 of them, were covering events leading up to the invasion. They were in a small town called Balabo. When the Indonesian soldiers came over the border from West Timor, they lined them up against a house and executed the 5 of them. There was only one journalist left in East Timor on the day of the invasion, December 7th, 1975. His name was Roger East. He was reporting for the world. He was reporting for the news services. He was an Australian. The Indonesian soldiers dragged him out of the radio station, brought him to the harbor, and shot him into it. As I said, for the next 16 years, they killed more than 200,000 people. In the summer of 1990, I went to East Timor with Allan Nairn, and we went back again this past October. We went this time because a Portuguese parliamentary delegation was supposed to be going there. This was a Very big deal for the Timorese. It was the first time the Portuguese would be allowed to come into what was formerly their colony before 1974. They were supposed to come in the beginning of November, and we went there planning to spend a week before they came, looking at how the Indonesians were preparing for the trip, being there through the trip, and being there afterwards to see what happened when the Portuguese left. But that trip was canceled. It was canceled ostensibly because the Indonesians objected to one of the journalists the Portuguese were taking. The Portuguese said they were standing up for freedom of the press, and no one backed down, and the trip was canceled. This was a tremendous disappointment, to say the least, for the people of Timor because of what had been happening. In the 2 weeks that they were expecting the Portuguese to come, we were going from village to village talking to people who had no opportunity to talk to each other because they were hundreds of miles apart. But everywhere we heard the same story. They said that Indonesian military rounded people up in small groups, from 7th and 8th graders to police wives to civil servants, and told them the same thing. If you speak to the Portuguese delegation, we will kill you after they leave, and we've already dug the mass graves for your bodies. As the Timorese bishop put it, the line most commonly used was, we will kill your family to the 7th generation. Well, leading up to the visit, what they thought would be the visit, people were dropping out of school and work. They didn't want to be arrested, tortured, killed before the Portuguese came. They wanted to have an opportunity to talk to them. The night before we arrived, Indonesian soldiers surrounded the Moteal Church, which is the flagship Catholic church in Dili, the capital of East Timor, and they shot into it, killing a young man named Sebastião Gomez, one of a group of young men who had gone to the church for sanctuary because they were being hunted down by the Indonesian army. Well, he was killed. The day after we got there, there was a funeral for him in the afternoon. About 1,000 people came to the church for the mass, and then they walked in a procession following his body up to the Santa Cruz cemetery to bury it. And as they walked, something very unusual, almost unheard of in Timor, happened. They put up their hands in a V sign and they said, "Viva East Timor, viva Sebastião, viva independence." This is unheard of in East Timor because all speech is forbidden, press is forbidden, freedom of assembly is forbidden. It was very bold of them to do this. But at this point, they felt they had no choice. The last sanctuary they had, the Catholic Church, had been violated. They were not only crying for Sebastião Gomez, but for their church. As they walked up and wound through the streets of Dili, soldiers were lined up along the road because every other building in Dili is a military or police building. But as long as the soldiers didn't do anything, they walked without incident. When they got to the cemetery, they went in, buried Sebastião Gomez, put flowers, sang hymns, and went home. For the next 2 weeks, we went around the country. And then on November 12th, early in the morning, about 6 o'clock, there was a mass, the 2-week anniversary of the death of Sebastião Gomez. More than 1,000 people came this time to the church. And after the mass, they gathered in the street. And now there were 2,000 people. And again, they marched. They retraced the procession of 2 weeks ago up to the cemetery, following young girls of Sebastião's family holding flowers. This time, they not only put up the V sign and said, "Viva East Timor," but they unfurled banners they had prepared for the Portuguese delegation, the delegation that never came. These banners said things like, "Why the Indonesians shoot our church, and Portugal, we are your responsibility." And in that way, they went up to the cemetery. The young boys, as you saw in the videotape, would start to trot ahead, and the older boys would shout, "Disciplina, disciplina," and they would hold them back. And they went up to the cemetery. Again, it had been just like it had been 2 weeks before. This time it was about 8 in the morning, and people were in front of the cemetery, lined up, talking to each other. We were interviewing people, and it was at this time that people were starting to go home. That is, until we saw ahead of us an Indonesian truck filled with about 50 soldiers, and these soldiers got out. Now, just to get a picture of this area, the people were in the road, and they were hemmed in by 2 walls, the walls of the Santa Cruz cemetery on one side and the military cemetery on the other. The only escape was to go backwards or to go into a small portal in the cemetery. The soldiers, the 50 soldiers, came in front of the large crowd of people. And then, from the direction the procession had come, hundreds of soldiers marched up in formation, in uniform, holding their M16s out in front of them. The crowd got very quiet. In the front, there was nowhere to go because there were so many people behind them. People started to step back and gasp. The soldiers kept on marching. It was as if watching something in slow motion. And as they came in front of the group of people, the first line and then the second line of people, the Indonesian soldiers picked up their guns. Just before they did that, Allan suggested that we go to the front of the crowd, because although we knew that the Indonesian soldiers had committed massacres in the past, they had never done it in front of Western observers, in front of foreign eyewitnesses. I had my tape recorder out, I put on my headphones, and I held my microphone out like a flag. Allan put the camera above his head, and we walked to the front. The soldiers came up, and without missing a beat, without any warning, without any provocation, they lined up in front of the people and they started mowing them down. From right to left and back again. And people were running, most were shot in the back, they were trying to run backwards, but they couldn't get out of the way. At the same time that they opened fire, another group of them enveloped us. One grabbed my microphone, threw me to the ground, and started to punch me in the face, kick me in the sides, and beat me with rifle butts as the others joined in. Allan was right behind me. He got a shot, a photograph of the soldiers opening fire. And as they beat me, he threw himself on top of me. They had dragged us right before the line of fire, right behind it. And then they beat him, swinging their rifle butts like bats until they fractured his skull. We were lying in the ground. Allan was covered with blood. And the only thing we could say was, "We are from America." At that point, they put the guns to our heads and decided whether or not to execute us. We kept shouting, "We're from America." They had stripped us of everything, all of my equipment, our bags. The only thing I had left was my passport in my pocket. I took it out, they grabbed it, threw it back at me, but they heard what we said, and we kept saying, "We're from America." We can only assume it was for that reason that they pulled the guns away from our heads. After all, we were from the same place their weapons were from. So there we were lying on the ground, Allan covered with blood, but we were very lucky. We were alive. All around us, Timorese were lying in the road, dead. The Timorese that hadn't been picked off at the beginning, soldiers moved in and picked them off one by one. As we were lying there, they dragged an old Timorese man next to us, beat him into a sewer ditch behind us, and every time he picked up his head, they would beat it down with a rifle butt or with their boot. At that point, a jeep came by, not a military jeep, and we were able to get into it. And the person who was driving picked up the old man and put him in the jeep. We drove off about 100 yards down the road. Some young Timorese flagged us down, and then dozens climbed into the jeep, inside, on top, hanging off the spare tire in the back. Some would fall off, others would pile on, because the soldiers were surrounding the cemetery and killing and beating people inside. In that way, we drove as a human mass to the hospital. At the hospital, people were already being dragged in. One young man was being operated on, another had his arm almost ripped off from gunshot, another had a bullet wound in his back, and more were coming in. We left the hospital, went into 2 places of hiding to figure out what to do. We were able to escape East Timor that day on the last flight out. Again, the Timorese were not that lucky. Just before we left, religious and medical people told us that they were not allowed to go up to the cemetery. The soldiers had sealed it off to administer first aid or last rites. A young man who was behind us in that crowd, named Kamal Bamadhaj, a New Zealander, was carrying a camera. He stepped back when we stepped forward. He was shot. The Red Cross found him hundreds of yards down the road. He was lying in the road waving his New Zealand passport. They picked him up, and a 2-minute ride to the hospital became a 25-minute ride because the soldiers kept detaining them, and Kamal Bamadhaj bled to death. The reason you were able to see the video that you saw today was that there was a British video man in the cemetery. He wasn't at the front, but he was in the cemetery, and the shot you saw was when the soldiers opened fire and people ran stumbling over each other into the cemetery. He was able to photograph that, and as the soldiers surrounded the cemetery, he realized he was going to be taken. So he buried his videotapes in a fresh grave, was arrested. 9 hours later, he was released. In the cover of night, he went to the cemetery, dug up those videotapes, and had them taken out of the country, and that's what you saw. The Indonesians would not allow any international investigation of the massacre. Instead, they put out their own military government preliminary report, in which they said a few renegade soldiers got out of hand. This was certainly not government policy, they said. But it was not a few renegade soldiers who sealed off the cemetery after the mass killing, not allowing any religious or medical people to save the people who were bleeding to death. This was government policy. It was not a few renegade soldiers who didn't allow the Red Cross to see the wounded for more than 2 weeks. This was government policy from the top in Jakarta. It was not a few renegade soldiers who are trying survivors of the massacre under anti-subversion laws. If found guilty, they face the death penalty. This is government policy. In December, the Indonesian government officially banned Allan Nairn and me from returning to the country, saying we're a threat to national security. In February, they banned all foreign journalists from East Timor. The State Department has called the Indonesian preliminary report serious and responsible. On February 26th, State Department spokesperson Richard Boucher said the U.S. was encouraged by the Indonesian actions after the massacre. Just a few hours before he made that statement, all journalists were banned. He didn't mention that. The State Department is also calling for an increase in military training aid to Indonesian soldiers, saying that aid instills democratic and humanitarian standards in Indonesian soldiers. If the Indonesian government wants to cut down on negative publicity, the answer is not to beat and kill and ban journalists, but to stop the killings, the detentions, and the tortures that have continued even since the November 12th massacre. In addition, they should abide by the 2 UN Security Council resolutions passed after the 1975 invasion, just like those passed against Iraq, calling on Indonesia to withdraw from East Timor without delay. But Indonesia is not going to do this without pressure. Our government provides $50 million in direct military and economic aid to Indonesia, plus approval for hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. weapons sales. While the Bush administration and Congress have condemned the massacre, as long as the United States refuses to cut off aid, it remains complicit in Indonesia's continued reign of terror against the people of East Timor.
Thank you. What we're talking about here is not policy, but crime. More specifically, a criminal policy on the part of the government of Indonesia and the government of the United States. I mean that in a very specific, objective sense. Indonesia invaded East Timor early on the morning of December 7th, 1975. On the morning of December 6, 1975, President Ford and Henry Kissinger were in Jakarta meeting with President Suharto, the ruler of Indonesia. The Indonesian military had recommended to Suharto in September of 1974, more than 1 year prior, a military move against East Timor. This is according to the CIA cables that were coming back to Washington. Suharto, however, told his generals to hold off. He was nervous. He was nervous because, as the State Department itself later acknowledged, 90% of Jakarta's military arsenal was supplied by Washington. There was a treaty between Indonesia and the United States, a treaty executed pursuant to U.S. law, which said that those weapons could not be used for offensive purposes. So if Suharto carried through with his general's recommendation and invaded East Timor, he would be breaking U.S. law. He would be violating the terms under which he had been given 90% of his weaponry. And the CIA and the DIA were cabling back to Washington that Suharto was very nervous about any possibility of U.S. dissatisfaction, about any threat of a cut in U.S. aid. Domestically, within the U.S. at this time, there was indeed some popular and congressional pressure to cut aid to Indonesia because Indonesia was an oil-producing state. The U.S. at that time was suffering the economic shock of the oil price increases. Aid to a country like Indonesia was rather unpopular. So Suharto wanted to be absolutely sure that any move he made on East Timor had the full approval of the United States from the highest levels. Throughout the year, he received signals and statements from Washington that the U.S. had no objection to an invasion of East Timor, but Suharto wanted to get the assurances face to face. And on the morning of December 6th, he got them from Ford and Kissinger. 16 hours later, Indonesian troops were coming ashore at Dili Bay. They swept ashore and went through the streets, dragging people out from their homes. By this time, the government of East Timor had retreated to the mountains with what guns they had left over from the Portuguese administration in hopes of mounting a guerrilla resistance. The population of Dili at this point was overwhelmingly civilian. The Indonesian troops dragged them out to the Aria Branca, the white sand beach, and lined them up along the beach, gunning them down with their American machine guns. They brought them down to the harbor, gathered crowds of people at gunpoint, ordered the crowds to count off one by one as the bodies fell. In this manner, they executed Roger East, the wire service reporter, the wife of the Timorese prime minister, the head of the Timorese Women's League, probably thousands of people in all. They wanted to send the message to the Timorese, Indonesia was here, this was the new rule in East Timor. As this was happening, detailed hour-by-hour reports were coming back to the White House and being relayed on to Ford's plane as he was traveling in Asia. The Australian military has a signal station set up in the northwest of Australia, which enabled them to intercept all Indonesian electronic communications. And they were able to give excruciatingly detailed hour-by-hour accounts on Indonesian military planning and strikes and so forth. What began on that day was one of the great massacres, one of the great genocides of the late 20th century. Kissinger and Ford, particularly Kissinger, had urged the Indonesians to get the invasion over with quickly. They were giving permission to violate U.S. law, but Kissinger was afraid that this could become an issue in the U.S. Congress. There's even a transcript of an internal State Department meeting which shows Kissinger berating his subordinates because some of them had put notes on paper regarding the U.S. policy toward Timor. He didn't want any of this to leak. But the theory was that if the Indonesians could get it over with quickly, use sufficiently massive force, they could have Timor before it became an issue in Congress. As it happened, they did not get it over with quickly. To this day, there is fierce resistance by the East Timorese, although at this point, the Timorese are essentially out of weapons. The Indonesian military estimates they have a couple hundred. I think that may be a credible estimate. What happened was that when the Indonesians came in, they found that those with guns resisted them in the hills, and the others, the people in the villages, picked up and left town. They retreated into the mountains rather than waiting in their villages for the entrance of the Indonesian troops. And a full 2 years after the invasion, Indonesia had still not secured control over a majority of the Timorese population. It was at this point, at the end of the Ford and the beginning of the Carter administration, that the United States shipped in planes and helicopters, particularly OV-10 Bronco planes designed for flying low over the trees, enabling them to machine gun and bomb at low altitudes. They used these planes and helicopters to bomb and strafe people out of the hills.
The Timorese were brought down and placed in resettlement camps. At one time, fully 1/2 of the national population of East Timor was in prisoner resettlement camps. In this camp, the Indonesian army imposed a policy of forced starvation. They restricted people from going out to farm their fields. They were afraid that if they got out into the fields, they would start talking to each other. They would start plotting against the army. They might make contact with those who are still refugees in the hills. They might make contact with the guerrillas in the hills. There are detailed Indonesian military manuals disclosing these procedures, which are now out, have leaked on the public record. Indonesia had sealed off East Timor to the world, but at months into this policy of forced starvation, a few international relief workers were able to get in. One described it as being worse than Biafra. A few photos have come out from that period showing children with limbs like pencils and the large heads and the distended bellies. As this was going on, the U.S. was continuing to pump military aid into Indonesia. Immediately after the invasion, the U.S. had reacted by doubling military aid to Indonesia, just as today the State Department is now calling for a doubling of U.S. military training aid in the wake of the November 12 Dili massacre. What Indonesia did in East Timor was, I think, in a sense, rather unusual in the annals of world repression. I've spent quite a few years covering some of the most repressive regimes on earth, places like El Salvador, Guatemala. These places are truly hell on earth. But I have to say that until I went to East Timor, I had never seen a place where the authorities had succeeded in making so many people quite so terrified. The reason is that the army set about a systematic dismantling of Timorese society. There are no unions in East Timor, no press, no student groups, no professional groups. All have been disbanded, their leadership executed, banned by military fiat. To the extent that the Timorese have a civic life, they conduct it underground. As you walk through Dili and start to talk to the people, you soon notice virtually every block contains a military or police base. Many of the houses which appear to be civilian dwellings are actually military torture and interrogation houses. We met with Governor Carrascolau, asked him about this. I asked the governor, do you know where the torture houses are? He said, of course, everybody knows where the torture houses are. I said, well, have you ever tried to go in one? Because he had been telling us up to that point that he was always trying to restrain the military in their repression against the people. He reacted with incredulousness to the question. He said, go into one of the torture houses? Are you kidding? I'm only the governor of East Timor. What if some lieutenant decides to shoot me? I don't have that kind of authority. This is the highest ranking Timorese authority. As we would walk in August of 1990, coming into Dili, people would approach you on the streets, anyone who was obviously a foreigner. They would sidle up very warily, very nervously, whisper something like, they'll kill us if they see us talking. And then very quickly, in very condensed form, they killed my father, they killed my wife, they killed my cousins. Please take a message to the Secretary General of the United Nations. Please inform the Prime Minister of Australia. Please tell the Congress of the United States. Time after time, place after place, in villages throughout the country, people would approach in this manner when you had a chance to get alone with someone, especially if you could speak to them in Portuguese. It was like people casting a bottle out onto the ocean with the message that they were trapped on an island with those who had just slaughtered a third of their relatives and friends and asking somehow for some kind of international aid. Many of these people had a sincere hope that if only the President of the United States could hear about this, if only the Congress could hear about what was going on, then they would help. That day on November 12th, the banners those people were carrying as they walked from the motel to the cemetery, many of them were pleas of that sort. They said things like, help us, President Bush, asking for help from Portugal, assuming that the U.S. could play a constructive and humane role. The fact of the matter is, though, that the guns that were trained on them, the M16s, were supplied by the United States. The go-ahead for the original invasion was given by the United States. The planes and helicopters which brought them down from the hills and into the prison camps were supplied by the United States. And on a day-to-day basis, the U.S. is backing this occupation of East Timor, which is illegal. It's a rather simple matter. The UN Security Council has passed 2 resolutions calling on Indonesia to withdraw without delay. These resolutions were not enforced. In his memoirs, Daniel Patrick Moynihan writes, he was the U.S. ambassador to the UN at the time, that he received orders from the State Department to see to it that the UN prove utterly ineffective in any measures it might undertake to enforce these resolutions. He said he carried this task out with no inconsiderable success. After the November 12 massacre, General Tri Sutrisno, the highest-ranking officer in the Indonesian military, the overall commander of the Indonesian military, gave a speech to a gathering of military graduates, a formal set-piece speech. He said, referring to those who had gathered outside the cemetery in Dili, he said, "These are despicable people, quote, people who must be crushed." He said, quote, "Delinquents like these agitators have to be shot, and we will shoot them." He added, "Come what may, let no one think they can ignore the Indonesian armed forces. In the end, they will have to be shot down." This was a statement of policy from the highest-ranking Indonesian officer. He repeated words to the same effect twice more, in the end saying, as soon as the army completed its investigation, they will move to annihilate all separatist elements in East Timor that have tainted the dignity of Indonesia. President Suharto himself referred to the massacre as a small thing. He told about on how on his world tour he would meet with world leaders and they would ask him what's going on in East Timor, and he then said he would point to the map. He said, "I showed them a map where East Timor is located, the tiny island called East Timor, that small thing that caused everybody to make a fuss." And he said they all laughed when he pointed out to them what a minuscule place this really was. As Indonesia got some international criticism, because we as foreigners happened to be there and witness and survive this, they responded, first with a report which said it was a group of renegade soldiers, second by transferring some generals out, finally by submitting several officers and soldiers to military discipline. They sent a new commander into East Timor, General Saiafi. He said that his predecessor had been too patient, had been too lenient, and he said that under his new regime in East Timor, they would no longer tolerate such demonstrations. He said that anyone who is an opponent of Indonesia would be hunted down. He said in a recent interview in the March 14th edition of Editor, quote, "If something similar to the 12 November event were to happen under my leadership, the number of victims would probably be higher." This is the new general they brought into East Timor in the ostensible reform, the ostensible constructive response to the massacre. Since the massacre, there have been reports which Amnesty International has characterized as credible of executions of eyewitnesses and survivors of the massacre. Others have been put on trial and are facing the death penalty. The head of the Indonesian Armed Forces has declared this was an act of policy. The new commander says they'll crack down and they'll kill even more next time. And the U.S. has responded by saying it wants to increase the military training aid. Why does it want to increase the aid? Because it will civilize the Indonesian military, as one congressional aide explained to me recently. This point of view, I think, is very unfair to the Indonesians. This idea that the U.S. has something to teach to the Indonesian military that will bring them to a more humanitarian plane of behavior. But if we look fairly and objectively at the record on East Timor, we're not just talking about the behavior of General Sutrisno. We're not just talking about the values of President Suharto. We're also talking about the values of Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger and Ronald Reagan and George Bush and those who staff the U.S. State Department, who day after day, as this running massacre has continued, have responded with fresh shipments of weaponry and fresh infusions of U.S. cash. For fiscal year 1990, the last year for which figures are available, there were more than $230 million worth of foreign military sales, shipments, government-to-government military aid into Indonesia. For fiscal year 1991, the Pentagon estimates there will be $50 million in foreign military sales agreements. For fiscal year 1991, in addition, the Pentagon estimates there will be $71 million in commercial military sales which are licensed by the U.S. government. Now, this happens to be a rather unusual case. It's unusual because we happen to be there. In terms of the internal history of East Timor, this was not an especially remarkable massacre in many respects. It certainly does not rank among the larger ones. There was the massacre at La Cluta, where, according to eyewitnesses, the soldiers slit open pregnant women with their machetes. After the Archbishop of East Timor denounced that massacre, Benny Murdani, who was then becoming defense minister of Indonesia, moved to have him removed from his post, and he succeeded in doing so. There was the massacre at Keras, in which hundreds, many hundreds, were killed. There are the running massacres in the internal countryside of East Timor. In this one, perhaps 200 people were massacred, but it happened to happen before our eyes. There happened to be a video cameraman there who was able to capture the people stumbling, covered with blood, into the cemetery. What this means is that the facts cannot be in dispute. Even the State Department, in talking about what has happened at this massacre, has not disputed the essential facts. They have pointed to a few claims by the Indonesians. One claim the Indonesians have made, for example, is that the soldiers were provoked because a soldier, they say, was stabbed along the route of march. Now, I happened to witness the clash along the route of march in which that stabbing allegedly took place. It didn't look to me at the time whether as if someone had been stabbed, but what was clear is that the other soldiers did not react. The march simply continued on to the cemetery. More than 40 minutes later, people were gathered outside, people were standing around quietly. Then the soldiers appeared up at once, and it was clear from the way they behaved that they had marched up with orders to commit a massacre. It was a very disciplined, orderly, cool, precise operation. The next day, General Sutrisno comes out and affirms that it was indeed an act of state. So the essential facts are not really in dispute. The only thing that is on the line now is what will the U.S. response be? For the first time in Congress, there are serious moves to cut U.S. military aid to Indonesia. 52 senators have signed a letter to President Bush calling on him to support self-determination for East Timor in the United Nations. A bipartisan group in the House, including Tony Hall, Democrat of Ohio, Frank Wolf, Republican of Virginia, Ron Makeley, Republican of Rhode Island, Tom Downey, Democrat of New York, Barney Frank, Democrat of Massachusetts, John Porter, Republican of Ohio, and various others will be moving to cut the U.S. military aid. The simple question now facing these legislators and now facing members of the American public is whether the U.S. wants to continue being an active participant, a criminal participant, in the ongoing mass murder of the East Timorese. This is not a subtle matter. This is not a difficult, agonizing matter. It is not a matter of ambiguity. It's a matter of the most simple moral choice. We happen to see it. We happen to see those people exploding in front of us in the street, running with blood, and them aiming and shooting these poor kids and older people in the back. It was unbelievable. It's indescribable. I just cannot convey to you what it was we saw. The video gives you a fraction of what happened there. It can't convey the full sense. But these were American M16s. These were your taxpayers' dollars at work. And now there's a choice in the Congress and a choice before the public. If the U.S. will continue, if the U.S. will support self-determination, free elections, free choice for the East Timorese, or whether it will continue to stand for mass murder in East Timor. It's really that simple. Thank you.
Well, there's a certain division of labor here, and I was originally going to say something about U.S. policy, but in view of Allan's and Noam Chomsky's expertise in this field, I'm going to talk about something different. And that is what, in my view, is Indonesians' policy in East Timor, something about why the massacre actually occurred, and why I think basically the game is already over from the point of view of Jakarta. Let me begin with a story. I'm going to make this as short as I can, that some of you may be aware of, which is that last month a small, sort of looked like a Mississippi ferry boat, was chartered with Portuguese funding to sail on a mission from the north of Australia into the harbour at Dili with the express idea of laying wreaths, expressing solidarity with the people who were killed in the massacre. And on this boat, I think not more than 100 students, journalists of different countries and so forth. Basically, people who wanted to express some kind of solidarity. This is a very small boat, not armed in any way at all. Well, this boat, at first sight, seemed to throw the Indonesian government into a complete panic. The head of the Navy said, major preparations were underway. The whole Navy was going to be thrown into the effort to stop this necessary ferry boat from penetrating subversively into Indonesian waters. The police, the army, the Marines all chimed in. And rather to my astonishment, newspapers showed detailed, as it were, plans for the defense of Dili, of East Timor, against this dangerous invasion. But what's really interesting is this, that in the accounts given by the general who Allan referred to, General Teo Shafii, who's just moved in to replace the previous commander, he said that we have 3 battle lines to defend the capital of East Timor against the invasion. And the 3 battle lines, of course, first was the Indonesian Navy out there patrolling the waters with guns ready. The next battle line was slight come down, it's immigration officers and the police, and then the third one that really counted, of course, is the military. So you had a 3-line defense against this invasion, rather different invasion from the one of 1975. But this had its sort of comic aspects to it. But what is very interesting is what then followed, because as the general began to talk on and on and on, he began to use a very strange kind of language, which I've never seen. I've been watching Indonesian politics for a long time, 25 years probably. And he began to use a language about what was going on in East Timor, which was really quite interesting. Because for years the Indonesian generals have been saying, well, it's all over by the shouting. There's just a few guerrillas up in the hills, just 2 or 3 there, got no guns left. It's all finished, it's all finished, it's all finished. Do you hear me? It's all finished, and so forth. And what the general now is saying is something quite extraordinary. What he is saying is that we have to be very careful, because if the boat arrives in the harbor, then there might be a muck by the masses. And it would be extremely dangerous if the masses, he always uses this word massa, would get out of hand. We recognize that the massa are very difficult to face. It's the task of every military officer to understand how to face the massa. No explanation, of course, where these masses have come from. And this, it seems to me, is very striking, because that this very hardline officer, in fact, is no longer talking the language of 3 or 4 people up in the hills, but is talking about masses who have to be a 3-line defense. It really has to be set up against, is in fact a backhanded recognition of what is now increasingly clear to people, I think, in the military themselves. That the gamble that was taken in 1975, that you could go in there, take over this place, kill off what was necessary in the terms of resistance, frighten the population, and then what you would do, the next step would be to fully absorb it into the country. And it's important to understand what that absorption involves. The calculation is, and it's an old calculation of occupying forces in many countries around the world, you get rid of the guys who are in power, you terrify the rest of the population, and then Because you don't want to kill everybody in the island. There's no point in that. What you do, what you want to do, is to get the kids. And you won't understand Indonesian policy in East Timor unless you realize alongside the prison camps, alongside the executions, alongside the torture, alongside the genocidal populations at certain points, there is also, and this is very typical of colonialism, you find it in British, French colonialism, you do genocide and you educate. You torture and you build roads. It's a very classical policy. And in fact, what has actually happened in East Timor under Indonesian rule is that, in fact, a lot of roads have been built, that a lot of office buildings. Dili now is a city in 4 or 5 times the size what it was when the Indonesians invaded. Many, many, many Timorese have, in fact, been put in school, told to read Indonesian books, taught Indonesian languages, and then, of course, find that there's no jobs for them when they get out of the schooling system. Timorese kids have been sent to universities in Indonesia, in Java, just as the Dutch used to send Indonesian students to study in Holland. Indonesians have, up to a certain point, permitted the church to operate, and that has meant that the church has now about twice as many people in Timor as faithful followers of the church as it had at the time of the invasion. That is, what I'm really trying to say here is that the irony of this is that Indonesia has actually done exactly what the Dutch and the French and the British colonials did before them. Same calculations are there, and what they're finding is what they should have realized, actually, if they'd looked at their own history. The Dutch colonized Indonesia for 300 years, brutalized it, exploited it, tortured, murdered, but they also built roads, they also constructed factories, they also began late in the game, but they definitely did, to put them in school. And of course it's precisely out of the schools, precisely out of the newspapers, precisely out of the modernization of life in the colony that the Indonesian nationalist movement emerged, which could never be turned back. It was only a matter of time before Indonesia would become an independent state. And I think what's happened in the last 10, 15 years, I have to say this frankly, that 8 or 9 years ago, 9, 10 years ago, when I used to go on talks like this, I was very pessimistic. I thought maybe the gamble might pay off, that so much deterioration, so much damage had been done to the Timorese that it was finished. But now I think the evidence is clear that, in fact, it's the Indonesian policy that's finished. There's no way of getting this back now. They've lost the younger generation. Kids. Those are the kids who were in the demonstration. Notice that many of those children were under 17 years old, under 20 years old. If so, they don't even remember the pre-Indonesian period. Carpetbaggers coming in to a small town which was traditionally theirs. I mean, they're perfectly aware of what's going on. And that consciousness, that solidarity, can't be destroyed and can't be turned back. Last May, I think it was, the SSRC sponsored a meeting on East Timor in Washington, to which, rather to our surprise, a senior Indonesian military intelligence officer showed up. But the most interesting person at that meeting was a young man called Dolenciano Gomez, a boy about 19 years old who'd actually been a leader of the organized protests to try and get in touch with the Pope when the Pope came to Dili some years ago. He'd been arrested and tortured for that. He managed to get out to Lisbon, and he'd come over to the United States. And what was extraordinary was that, without any sense of irony, Dolenciano and I spoke to each other. I didn't know Portuguese. His English was very shaky. We spoke to each other happily in Indonesian. That was the language of communication between us. So the idea that you could, that the language somehow does you in, of course, isn't true at all. It was then taken off to the Washington Post offices, where he found somebody high up on, I was going to say Jason Robards' staff, but you'll get my point, who was a Portuguese speaker, and they chatted happily in Portuguese together, even though Portuguese has effectively been legally banned by the Indonesians for a long time. And the interesting thing was to watch that boy and the head of this military intelligence man, who had actually been a senior intelligence officer in Dili and you could see who had confidence, which of the two thought the future was on his side. So I think, in spite of the grim news of this massacre, it's not the end of a long series of murders. It's the beginning of the end for Indonesian policy. There is much more concern now than there's ever been about East Timor in the outside world. The Indonesians have been forced to withdraw from the international consortium of aid because the Dutch government criticized them for what's going on here. The Canadian government briefly suspended aid. Times have changed, but most importantly, the logic of history itself shows us, I think, quite clearly that the masses, have the future on their side.
I'll have a somewhat different perspective from the others who've spoken before me about many things, but not about one of them. What happened on November 12th, 1991 in Dili, East Timor was a tragedy. The description by Amy and by Allan makes that clear. The film makes that clear. It was a tragedy. Nothing can defend what took place there. No one should attempt to. The United States State Department condemned it and condemned it forcefully. The Indonesian army and police units fired on unarmed civilians engaged in a political demonstration. They killed and wounded scores of people. It was indefensible. Another tragedy of that incident, in my opinion, is the setback it represented to progress, because there had been progress in at least the previous 2 years in East Timor. Following the arrival in late 1989 of a new military commander there, the State Department had noticed a marked decline in human rights abuses. General Waro developed a cooperative relationship with East Timor Governor Karaskalao and with Bishop Bello of the Catholic Church. He began to emphasize civic action efforts in the villages rather than combat operations in the field. At the same time, East Timor was open to outside visitors. That improving atmosphere clearly changed last fall, when discussions between Indonesia and Portugal, under the UN Secretary General's auspices, brought tentative agreement for a visit to East Timor by a Portuguese parliamentary delegation. That news raised the hopes of anti-integrationist elements. It also led to increased Indonesian security operations, and that combination of factors greatly heightened tensions there. When the visit was canceled at the last moment because of the dispute over credentials of a journalist, frustrations among the anti-integrationists heightened. And those frustrations found expression on November 12th, during the visit of a UN official to Dili, which coincided with the commemoration service for the death 2 weeks earlier of an anti-integrationist who died as a result of a confrontation with the pro-integrationist forces at Montreal Church. During a march through city streets, anti-Indonesia demonstrators were vocal, and a few were violent. An army major was stabbed. It appears that local military units then took revenge. The United States government publicly condemned the Dili incident. We said, and we said flatly, no provocation could have possibly warranted such a wanton military reaction. The excessive use of force was unjustified. It was reprehensible. We immediately called for a complete and credible investigation, leading to appropriate punishments for those who resorted to or condoned such deadly force. We clearly conveyed our views at high levels in both Jakarta and Washington. Our embassy in Jakarta immediately dispatched a team of officers to Dili. I was among them. At the time, our hope and expectation was that Indonesia would move vigorously to find the facts, assess responsibility, appropriately punish those responsible, and take steps to prevent such an event from occurring again. We have been encouraged by Indonesia's response. President Suharto promptly formed the National Investigatory Commission. Its preliminary report clearly answered several key questions. Was excessive force used? Yes, it was. Should the military personnel involved be punished? Yes, they should. Was it government policy? No, it wasn't. We and most other concerned foreign observers, including Australia, Japan, and the European community, have judged the preliminary report to be a serious and responsible effort by the government of Indonesia. The report confronted those very tough issues for Indonesia, and it directly refuted many of the initial assertions about the event put forward by the Indonesian Armed Forces, including its Commander-in-Chief, General Trisno. I'll just capsulize what that report said. It said the official casualty totals had been far too low. It moved them up to more realistic levels, flatly contradicting the earlier figures announced by the armed forces. It made the key determination that the excessive force was used and that some troops were clearly out of control. It found that this incident was not the result of government policy, and it asserted that those who violated the law must be prosecuted. President Suharto immediately followed up, and we have been encouraged by those follow-up actions. On receiving the preliminary findings, which were critical of his army, which has been his base of support, the President immediately made the report public and extended his deep apology to the families of innocent victims. He has publicly apologized to the nation 3 times. The President immediately relieved 2 general officers of their duties, the regional and provincial military commanders. The lower level commanders, all the way down the chain, have also been relieved. He ordered formation of a military council of honor to recommend Army punishments and reforms, with the intention that no such incident shall ever take place again in Indonesia. On the basis of the Council of Honor's recommendation, 6 senior officers are being disciplined, 3 of them being dismissed outright from the service. 8 officers and enlisted men face courts-martial, and 5 others remain under investigation. President Suharto also ordered the Armed Forces Commander, General Trisno, to account for the missing people, and he ordered increased efforts to improve the well-being of the Timorese people. We have monitored the situation in East Timor closely since November 12th. I'd appreciate an opportunity to be heard too. Thank you. We have monitored the situation in East Timor closely since November 12th. Embassy Jakarta has sent officers to the province 5 times since the incident. The most recent visit in March reaffirmed earlier findings that there is absolutely no evidence to substantiate allegations of additional killings since November 12th. Some detainees were abused in the days immediately after November 12th. We understand that such mistreatment ceased thereafter. The most recent visits confirmed earlier reports that while tensions in Dili do continue, they have eased considerably from November. Economic and social life have returned to normal, although security does remain tight. 8 demonstrators in Dili and 5 in Jakarta are being tried on criminal charges. The military courts-martial should begin soon. International observers, including officers from Embassy Jakarta, have been attending the criminal trials and are seeking to observe the upcoming courts-martial. The State Department will continue to monitor closely the Indonesian government's efforts to follow through on the National Commission's judgments of responsibility. That process continues. And we will continue to watch the human rights situation in East Timor with great care, as we have. In particular, we have urged the Indonesian government to maintain an open access to the province. The State Department believes that the interests of truth and the amelioration of the situation in East Timor are clearly best served by a policy of more, not less access there. Some people believe Jakarta's response to these events has been inadequate and that diplomatic suasion is insufficient. They urge that we cut U.S. security or economic assistance to Indonesia. You've heard that already this evening. Such a course, in our view, would not produce the desired results which we all seek and could have very negative consequences for U.S.-Indonesia relations, for our limited influence in Indonesia, and most importantly, for the people of East Timor. It is important to encourage, not discourage, constructive trends in the human rights situation in Indonesia. Some elements within the Indonesian government did initially resist efforts to redress the November 12th tragedy. That's obvious. They wanted to confront international opinion by whitewashing the Dili episode. But those forces and those forces would likely be reinforced by a response on our part which denigrated what President Suharto has done, contrary to those efforts. If Indonesia were a human rights pariah, which had ordered a massacre, or if it had produced a whitewash and disregard for world opinion, an argument for demonstrating our opprobrium by cutting off security and economic assistance would be more understandable. But that is not the case. The Indonesian government has accepted that the November incident was a tragedy. It has taken responsibility for the actions of its troops. It has already announced punishments for some senior military officers, preparing to bring other wrongdoers to trial, and is working to ensure that such violent use of force by its troops does not recur. It seems evident that continuing cooperative engagement, not retribution, best serves the human rights goals we all seek. Our human rights dialogue continues, and our welcome access to senior officials in Jakarta is particularly important when it comes to lobbying effectively on human rights issues. As discussion in this forum apparently is going to include the United States' response to Indonesia's invasion of 1975 and incorporation of the province in 1976, I'll mention a few relevant aspects of the historical record as well, expanding a bit upon what Professor Steiner said. After the April 1974 leftist coup in Portugal, Lisbon decided to rapidly decolonize its overseas empire. This resulted in widespread chaos, civil conflict, and foreign intervention in Portugal's former colonies. When the new Portuguese government in 1974 decided to decolonize, East Timor was completely unprepared for self-governance. 4 centuries of colonialism had left East Timor with 1 high school, fewer than 10 college graduates, and a literacy rate under 10%. Portugal and Indonesia held discussions about the colony's future, but a civil war erupted before any agreement was reached. The combatants were Fretilin, which sought immediate creation of an independent Marxist state, Apadeti, which advocated immediate integration into Indonesia, and UDT, which preferred a gradual decolonization process. Portugal's leftist government abruptly withdrew in August 1975, handing over to Fretilin weapons which were then used to gain the upper hand. In the face of an imminent Fretilin military victory and the declaration of an independent Marxist state, Indonesia invaded in December of 1975 and indicated it did so at the request of the East Timorese factions opposed to Fretilin. So when the world turns its attention to East Timor in the mid-1970s, the choice was stark: Marxist Fretilin or Indonesia. While neither had a mandate from the ballot box, there was no middle ground between them. And the political context is significant here. Fretilin military action in East Timor occurred amidst active communist insurgencies in much of Southeast Asia, as the U.S. was departing from Vietnam, and with memories of a communist threat to Indonesia in the 60s still fresh. Non-communist governments everywhere in Southeast Asia were fearful of attempts to topple them. In assessing Indonesia's actions, it's also important to recall that since President Suharto rose to power in the mid-1960s, Indonesia has not had an expansionist agenda. East Timor is the only addition to what was once Dutch colonial territory. In the minds of Indonesian leaders, whose bedrock principle is the unity of their archipelagic country, once East Timor had been incorporated, its standing became a symbol of the integrity of the nation. Those leaders look at the hundreds of distinct ethnic groups and languages within Indonesia, and at the presence of several major religions. They recall regional rebellions from the 1950s, and they fear that loosening even one thread of the national fabric could stimulate other secessionist threats. Within this historical framework, in 1976, U.S. policymakers decided to accept Indonesia's incorporation of East Timor as an accomplished fact. They judged that nothing the United States or the world was prepared to do could change that fact. And U.S. interests with Indonesia, including a human rights dialogue, were important and should continue. With such reality in mind, previous administrations, including the Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Bush administrations, fashioned a policy which has been followed consistently on a bipartisan basis. We accept Indonesia's incorporation of East Timor without maintaining that a valid act of self-determination has taken place. Since 1976, we have maintained a constructive dialogue with the Indonesian government designed to promote the well-being of the people of East Timor. Included in this has been an ongoing human rights dialogue, as I mentioned. Politically, we support discussions between Indonesia and Portugal under the auspices of the UN Secretary General. We believe such a dialogue continues to be the most promising avenue for resolving the East Timor issue. We are pleased that a dialogue between Indonesia and Portugal at the UN Human Rights Commission meetings in Geneva led to a constructive and balanced chairman's statement concerning human rights in East Timor. Economically, our constructive relationship with Indonesia has allowed us to extend assistance to all Indonesians, which especially benefit East Timorese. On a per capita basis, we have provided more than twice as many AID project dollars to East Timor since 1988 as to the rest of Indonesia. Additionally, Indonesia has, on a per capita basis, funneled over 6 times as much of its own economic development budget into East Timor as to any other province. In 1991, East Timor received about $170 million in Indonesian government grants. That is almost exactly in nominal terms 100 times the average yearly development expenditure for East Timor in the last days of colonial rule. The results of that investment are striking, as Ben Anderson pointed out. In 1974, after 4 centuries of colonial rule, East Timor had only 47 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, 1 high school, and no colleges. Now it has 574 elementary schools, 99 middle schools, 14 high schools, and 3 colleges. In 1974, East Timor had 2 hospitals and 14 health clinics. Now it has 10 hospitals and 197 village health centers. In 1974, East Timor had 100 churches. Today it has 518. In 1974, East Timor was plagued by endemic poverty. Today, poverty certainly remains a problem, as it does elsewhere in that part of Indonesia. But starvation is extremely rare today. The missing economic element is sufficient employment to fulfill rising expectations of newly educated youth. But new business ventures insist on a peaceful environment, and that remains problematic until the East Timor issue is fully resolved. Thanks.
Well, in accord with decisions about division of labor, I'm going to shift the focus from Southeast Asia back to the United States. I want to talk a bit about government policy towards Indonesia and the Indonesian aggression in East Timor in particular. And I also want to talk some about how all of this has been presented to the American public. And I want to mention a little bit about a broader context in which I believe that what's been happening, which indeed is one of the great atrocities of the 20th century, can become intelligible. Well, let me begin with New York Times. On April 16th, 1992, Paul Lewis, their UN correspondent, he's writing about sanctions against Libya. And he says that the sanctions against Libya show how the collapse of communism has given the UN the cohesion needed to enforce its orders. That was impossible in earlier crises, like Indonesia's annexation of East Timor. That is, when Indonesia annexed East Timor, the UN just couldn't get its act together because of the disruptive commies who were around, but fortunately now they're gone. Well, you already heard a somewhat different picture of that given by the U.S. ambassador, Daniel Moynihan. I'll repeat it. Moynihan's picture was the following. The United States wished things to turn out as they did and worked to bring this about. The Department of State desired that the United Nations prove utterly ineffective in whatever measures it undertook. This task was given to me, and I carried it forward with no inconsiderable success. He adds that within 2 months, some 60,000 people had been killed, quoting Moynihan still, 10% of the population, almost the proportion of casualties experienced by the Soviet Union during the Second World War. You'll notice there's no ambiguity there about the disruptive force. The Times constantly does discuss Daniel Moynihan and international law. He's regularly lauded there for his lifelong dedication to international law and opposition to aggression and so on, but somehow they've missed his account of what he and the State Department were up to in 1975. The Lewis article is quite typical. not only of the coverage of East Timor, but also of the UN and the Cold War. Well, let me give a little background. In the early post-war planning for the world, the United States had, the State Department and the U.S. generally had special plans for Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia was to, as George Kennan's policy planning staff in the State Department put it, Southeast Asia must fulfill its main function in providing resources and raw materials for the reconstruction of Europe and Japan. The CIA, in one of its earliest reports, said that we must maintain the colonial economic interests of Western Europe and Southeast Asia. Crucially, Kennan added, we must restore what he called Japan's empire toward the south. That is, the co-prosperity sphere that Japan had tried to construct, to which the United States basically had only one objection. They were leaving us out. But now we would reconstruct it for them, now under U.S. control as part of the global system that the U.S. was organizing and running. And Indonesia was crucially important in this. In December 1948, Kennan called Indonesia the most crucial issue in our struggle with the Kremlin. What's it got to do with the Kremlin? Well, the Kremlin was, that's kind of a code word for neutralism. The threat basically was the threat of neutralism all over the world, in Europe and Japan and so on. Neutralism was regarded by Dean Acheson and Chief of Staff Omar Bradley and others as suicidal, in their words. The fall of Indonesia, Kennan said, would spread the infection to Burma, India, Pakistan, Australia. The same reasoning, incidentally, led to the war in Vietnam. This nationalist infection, it was feared in Vietnam, might spread to Indonesia, ultimately beyond, even to what John Dower, one of the leading Asia historians here, calls the super domino. Well, concerns about Indonesia mounted through the 1950s. It was ruled by Sukarno, an independent nationalist, who tried to balance Indonesian politics between the two major forces there, the army and the PKI, the Communist Party, which was the only mass-based political party. In 1957-58, the CIA, U.S. participated and backed an armed insurrection against Sukarno, which failed. In the early 60s, concerns mounted. Guy Pawker, a government scholar and a study published by Princeton University, urged his contacts in the Indonesian military, I'm quoting, to take full responsibility for their country, strike, sweep their house clean. Another leading foreign policy analyst, Professor William Kintner of University of Pennsylvania, warned that if the PKI is able to maintain its legal existence and Soviet influence continues to grow, the same code word, it is possible that Indonesia may be the first Southeast Asia country to be taken over by a popularly based, legally elected communist government. Therefore, he said, with Western help, free Asian political leaders, that is, the kind who are going to lose if there's an election, together with the military, must not only hold on and manage, but reform and advance while liquidating the enemy's political and guerrilla armies. Pawker then expressed his concern that the groups backed by the United States, in his words, would probably lack the ruthlessness that made it possible for the Nazis to suppress the Communist Party of Germany. He said these right-wing and military elements that we support, the free leaders, are weaker than the Nazis, not only in numbers and in mass support, but also in unity, discipline, and leadership. Well, Pawker's pessimism proved unfounded. In October 1965, the pro-American General Suharto took charge, and he launched a bloodbath of which the Nazis would have been proud. Hundreds of thousands of people, mostly landless peasants and plantation workers, were slaughtered within a few months. The public Western reaction to this orgy of bloodshed was relief and pride. The Deputy Undersecretary of State, Alexis Johnson, celebrated what he called the reversal of the communist tide in the great country of Indonesia, an event which he said will probably rank along with the Vietnamese War as perhaps the most historic turning point of Asia in this decade. That was in October 1966 when the full toll was known. Secretary of Defense McNamara testified before Congress that U.S. military aid to Indonesia had, in his words, paid dividends and was therefore justified, the major dividends being a huge pile of corpses. In a private communication to the President, McNamara went further. He said that U.S. military assistance to the Indonesian army had encouraged it to move against the PKI when the opportunity was presented, that is, after the Suharto coup. Particularly valuable, he said, was the program bringing Indonesian military personnel to the United States for training at U.S. universities. You'll notice that we've been civilizing them for quite a long time. A congressional report also held that the training and the continued communication with military officers paid enormous dividends, namely this mass slaughter. In November 1966, Freedom House published an advertisement signed by what they called 145 distinguished Americans, including distinguished Harvard professors, which justified the U.S. war in Vietnam for having, as they put it, provided a shield for the sharp reversal of Indonesia's shift towards communism. No reservations expressed about the means that were used. McGeorge Bundy, who moved from Harvard Dean on to National Security Advisor, years later in the mid-'80s, observed that it would have been wise for the United States to have stopped, or at least reduced, the Vietnam War in 1965, when, as he put it, a new anti-communist government took power in Indonesia and destroyed the Communist Party, incidentally slaughtering some 700,000 people or so. There was no condemnation of the slaughter on the floor of Congress. No major U.S. relief agency offered aid. The World Bank quickly restored Indonesia to favor. Western governments and corporations followed suit, which was a reflection of their pleasure at the course of events. Now, what about the media? Well, they were pleased, in fact, euphoric. In October 1965, as the slaughter was just getting underway, Times correspondent Max Frankel, who's now editor-in-chief, described the delight of Johnson administration officials over the dramatic new opportunity in Indonesia. The military showed power, so Indonesia can now be saved what had appeared to be an inevitable drift towards a peaceful takeover from within. Peaceful takeover from within is code word. It means democratic politics, the worst conceivable tragedy, of course. U.S. officials, he said, believe the army will cripple and perhaps destroy the communists as a significant political force, leading to the elimination of communist influences at all levels of Indonesian society. So we don't have to worry about this peaceful takeover from within. Consequently, he said, there is now hope where only 2 weeks ago there was despair. Well, that was October 65. As the results started coming in, the joy mounted. In mid-1966, well after the facts were known, U.S. News and World Report had a long and enthusiastic story with the headline, Indonesia, Hope Where There Once Was None. Time magazine had a cover story which celebrated the West's best news for years in Asia. The heading was Vengeance with a Smile, had 5 full pages of text and 6 more of pictures devoted to what it called the boiling bloodbath that almost unnoticed took 400,000 lives. It then informed us that the new army regime which carried this out is scrupulously constitutional, based on law and not mere power. The authority was General Suharto, its quietly determined leader with his almost innocent face. The New York Times featured a column headed A Gleam of Light in Asia. It's by its leading political commentator, the highly revered James Reston, who said that we should not let the bad news in Vietnam displace the more hopeful developments in Asia, primary among them being what he called the savage transformation of Indonesia from a pro-Chinese policy under Sukarno to a defiantly anti-communist policy under General Suharto. He said, Washington is being careful not to claim any credit for this change in one of the most richest countries in the world, but this does not mean that Washington had nothing to do with it. He said, it is doubtful that the coup would ever have been attempted without the American show of strength in Vietnam, or been sustained without the clandestine aid it received indirectly from here. So we should be very proud that our government contributed to the greatest slaughter since the days of Hitler and Stalin. Editorial reaction generally was the same. Suharto went on to compile one of the worst human rights records in the world at home, along with slaughter in West Papua, the invasion and slaughter in East Timor, and so on. The West remained quite pleased. In 1987, the Christian Science Monitor observed correctly that many in the West were keen to cultivate Jakarta's new moderate leader. Suharto is moderate because he only slaughters people for our benefit. The London Economist added that despite appearances, this great mass murderer and torturer is, they said, at heart benign. That's referring doubtless to his attitude towards Western corporations, which is indeed very benign. With respect to Timor, the reaction was quite the same. You've heard a number of things about the well, I mentioned, say, Moynihan's expression of the government position. As far as press coverage is concerned, in 1974 and 75, there was quite a lot of coverage of Timor in the context of fears about what was going to happen with Portuguese decolonization. Then when Indonesia invaded and started the slaughter, the press coverage started to decline. It reached a flat zero in 1978 as the slaughter reached genocidal levels, with new flows of aid from the U.S. government because Indonesia was actually running out of arms. So the Carter administration took a little time off from moral lessons about human rights to ensure that the slaughter would be completely genocidal. What press coverage there was endless lies, repeating either State Department or Indonesian propaganda. So, for example, Henry Kam, the leading New York Times Southeast Asia correspondent and an old Asia hand, he claimed that, his words, many Timorese have been forced to live under control of the Fretilin guerrillas, but they're now fleeing to areas where they can be protected by the Indonesian government. His authority was Indonesian generals. Even the worst Stalinist party hack rarely descended to that. Kam adds that there's some protests about East Timor, but he said these are just an attempt by highly vocal left-wing students in Australia to bash the West. You will recall that this is the old Asia hand. Others were pretty much the same. The press flatly refused to interview refugees. There were thousands of them in Lisbon and thousands more in Australia. In desperation, some of those refugees were brought to the United States in the late 70s. Actually, I brought a group of them myself. Zero effect. Nobody would interview them. William Shawcross was trying to justify the dramatic difference in reaction to the slaughter in East Timor and the one in Cambodia at the same time, comparable slaughter. And he said, well, he's going to give a structurally serious reason for this. It was too hard to gain access to refugees from Timor. That is, you couldn't expect a British journalist to take the trip all the way from London to Lisbon instead of, say, taking that hourly shuttle to the Thai-Cambodia border. So it goes on. I'll read you a few things from the State Department. Robert Oakley, in 1977 hearings, said there are probably under 10,000 casualties. Indonesia, at the same time, estimated them at 50 to 80,000. Oakley's 10,000 figure was then repeated by Robert Chaplin in the New Yorker. He said there are no serious atrocities, few excesses by units that got out of control, just like this time. Commanders called back to Indonesia and punished. 78 hearings. We've been on the right track in encouraging Indonesia to do a better job in assisting the people of the territory who are fleeing from Fretilin control to areas where they can be protected by the Indonesian government. Remember, this is when the massacre's reaching genocidal levels. The State Department legal advisor informed Congress with a straight face that the incorporation of East Timor into Indonesia followed unanimous approval by the People's Council of East Timor of a petition asking Indonesia to accept integration of East Timor into Indonesia. Country officer for Indonesia testified in a hearing on the Indonesian invasion that the purpose of U.S. military aid is to keep that area peaceful. The people are relatively happy with the fact that they are now under Indonesia, he said. Well, I won't go on because time is running out, or maybe has run out, but this goes on right up until today. Nothing has changed. The most recent reports that I've seen from they come from Australian journalists who just got kicked out of Indonesia about 3 weeks ago, of Timor about 3 weeks ago, is that terror is increasing, torture is increasing, midnight raids are increasing. He was kicked out summarily from East Timor, and they stole his film, which included film of tortured people who'd been tortured with their ears cut off. He said, while I was there in early April, Indonesian troops were raiding houses and pulling teenagers out to send them to the torture chambers and so on. That's a brief, much too brief sample of the evidence. I wish I shared Ben Anderson's optimism about what all this is going to lead to. In my view, it depends very crucially on what happens here.
We will move to questions from you now, but let me start with a combination comment and question from Mr. Nino Brito, who is here from the Portuguese Embassy in Washington.
Well, good evening. I am the representative tonight of the government, who is the administering power of the non-self-governing territory of East Timor, according to the United Nations relevant resolutions approved in '75 and then afterwards. I just would like to give you some remarks on 3 points. The self-determination question, the human rights dimension, and the development issues which were brought to us by Larry Dinger. Well, we view as positive the administration's acknowledgement that a valid act of self-determination has not taken place yet in East Timor. Therefore, we feel puzzled and dismayed with the recognition of the incorporation as well as with the fact that the United States considers East Timor as a quote-unquote a province. I'm not going to recall you the example of what happened with Kuwait, but I would just point out that a fait accompli is not and cannot be taken as a relevant argument in terms of international law. We have no choice in Portugal. If you ask me, what does Portugal want from East Timor? It would be a very good question, but we have no choice but fighting for self-determination. It's a moral imperative for us. We never rejected our share of blame for what happened in East Timor in '74, in '75. But we do feel that it is absurd to deny the East Timorese people the right for self-determination, bearing in mind the sufferings and the horrible situation that they have been facing since the invasion. It is also, it's not well known, but it is also a constitutional requirement in Portugal that we have to try to find out a solution for East Timor. And it's written in the Portuguese constitution that every single Portuguese government has to seek for a just and balanced solution for the East Timorese problem, if you could say. We find out that it is ironic that the chairman state of the non-aligned movement, itself a former colony, has adopted such a ruthless colonialist behavior with regard to East Timor. Let me stress that Portugal has no claims whatsoever to the sovereignty over East Timor. Our sole aim is to bring about its decolonization process in observance of the principles of the United Nations Charter, and any choice, I repeat, any choice to be freely expressed by the population concerned would be fully respected by Portugal. I would remind you again that East Timor is proportionally one of the most serious cases confronting the international community when we analyze the human rights situation over there. That's why we do not agree with those who claim that the human rights situation in East Timor had improved before the November 12th massacre. It was a massacre, not an incident. It was not an isolated fact. We see it as a repetition of a pattern confirmed by the analysis of other governments and NGOs everywhere. We also fear that any such incidents will recur while the underlying causes remain unresolved. Let me also point out that we feel, in Portugal, we feel that the end of the Cold War should enable certain countries to make a different evaluation of the situation in East Timor. We should not draw a distinction between good and bad human rights violators. For us, there is only a definition for those who violate, who do not comply with the rules of international law. And quite honestly, we feel that we should stop looking under our beds for Marxist movements as a kind of a stalking horse for condoning unspeakable human rights violators from a number of governments. We also feel that it's fruitless to engage in comparisons on the development in East Timor between the Portuguese rule and Indonesian colonization. I think that we should not omit the burdensome and unjustified human hardships resulting from the occupation, because it is an occupation and it is going on at this point. And we just say that if the development had brought well-being to the East Timorese, the presence of up to 20,000 soldiers would not be necessary. We know that the control of the hearts and minds of the people is a well-known practice of repression, and it is used when other tools of terror prove ineffective. We have that experience because we were, unfortunately, a former colonial power until '74, and the coup, which was referred as a leftist coup, and which brought us democracy in Portugal in '74, Let me underline also that as we speak, Timorese civilians are, quote, standing trial, unquote, in Jakarta and Dili. And we feel that we should bear in mind that Indonesia is still ignoring the assurances it gave on March 4 when it subscribed to the Human Rights Commission consensus, which called on it to improve the human rights situation in East Timor, to facilitate access to the territory for human rights organizations, and to ensure a fair trial for the civilians arrested during and after the Santa Cruz massacre. In addition, despite those assurances, Indonesia continues to detain individuals not charged with acts of violence. In conclusion, let me just say that we consider encouraging that the administration's support to the talks between Portugal and Indonesia to resolve the East Timor question. The United States are friendly and country and ally of Portugal, and that means that we are able to engage in a very frank discussion on these issues as well on other issues. But I would say that I would remind you that we propose that with no preconditions, negotiations between all parties concerned, and that includes the representatives of the East Timorese people, would be initiated as soon as Indonesia would be ready for that. We are ready to talk, and we said that on January the 24th in a proposal that my foreign minister presented to the Secretary General of the United Nations. We just hope that Indonesians Well, we have not yet given an answer to this proposal. Replace their well-known readiness for repression with a readiness to discuss the issue in a constructive way. Thank you.
I guess the tradition is to, goodness, there are 2 microphones. I wasn't aware of that. So let's move. No political connotations from left to right and then back to left and back to right. And can I ask you to keep these very clearly questions and not comments? The first was really meant to be a comment. The others are not. So keep them brief. Give a chance for more people to ask questions. Address them either to a particular panel member or generally, and whoever will respond. Yes.
I'd just like to start with, start and finish with 2 very brief observations. I give my thanks to the Kennedy School for providing this quite riveting display of very grim reality on the one side and very black fantasy by the State Department on the other. As an Australian, I would like to point out my sense of outrage that must join many Americans in this audience. The Australian government has been almost as culpable as the American government in supporting the present regime in Indonesia. May I take issue with Mr. Anderson, who paints a very benevolent picture of a cyclical colonial rule, which by his estimation, in comparison with the Dutch, we will only see 284 more years of this sort of brutality. Last observation is, can I point out that Dr. Chomsky has been an almost lone voice in the wilderness and has championed the rights of the East Timorese for many years before the November 12th massacre so grimly brought their plight to our attention. Can I ask Dr. Chomsky what he thinks should be done now by the international community in terms of trying to force these UN sanctions, which are ignored in so many cases and are obeyed in selected cases such as the war on Iraq, what steps he would advocate? Thank you.
Well, let me first, just to correct the record, say that Ben Anderson, I have been involved in this issue for a long time. Ben has been involved for a longer time. And in fact, I started getting involved in part after reading and hearing what he was saying about it. And of course, he knows about 100 times as much about this topic as I do. But now, as far as what should be done, well, you know, if the Iraq invasion of Kuwait is a model, what we ought to do is bomb Jakarta, obviously. In fact, probably nuke Jakarta, since, and in fact, while we're at it, we probably ought to nuke Washington because they've been supporting it. However, nobody assumes that the Iraq model has any meaning. This is regarded as the Kuwait model. I mean, this is just a total fraud. I can actually don't have time to do it, so let me do it now. One of the grand moments in my life, I should say, was just right before the U.S. and Britain started up the war in early January, mid-January last year. I succeeded in being denounced by 2 foreign ministers within about a week, Douglas Hurd of Great Britain and Gareth Evans of Australia. Evans was particularly upset because I quoted him. Which is, and if you hear what Australia is up to, you'll see that, you know, there's a lot of competitors for atrocity chief in this area. Indonesia took advantage of the invasion of Kuwait to launch a new, the world attention over there, launch a new military operation in November 1990. Meanwhile, Australia continued to consummate its treaty with Indonesia to rob Timorese oil. This was brought up in Australia in the Parliament, and Gareth Evans, the foreign minister, was asked, well, you know, isn't this a little funny? I mean, isn't it kind of as if what it would be like is as if, say, in the middle of while Iraq was occupying Kuwait, if, say, Libya Kuwaiti oil. Somehow this doesn't look quite right. Australia's response, not unlike the U.S. State Department, is that there is no binding legal obligation not to recognize acquisition of territory that was acquired by force. The world is a pretty unfair place, littered with examples of acquisition by force. That's Indonesia, Indonesia, Timor, and Australia taking Timorese resources. Of course, at the same time, big countries cannot invade small neighbors and get away with it, referring to Iraq and Kuwait. The New Order, which is established by the virtuous Anglo-Americans, in that would-be aggressors will think twice about invading smaller neighbors. The weak will feel more secure. All nations should know that the rule of law must prevail in international relations. Well, the last comment I would agree with, and I think that's the answer to your question. The rule of law should prevail in international relations. It's quite clear it was violated radically in both first by Iraq, then by us in the Middle East. It's been violated radically by Indonesia and all their supporters, which include the United States, Australia, Holland, Canada, England, Sweden. We can go on and on. It's a very ugly list. And the right answer is, I think, simply to follow the rule of law. That is, to allow the people of East Timor the which they certainly merit. And that could easily happen. It could happen if the West changes its tune. In other words, instead of joining in with Australia in robbing Timorese oil, as about a dozen oil companies are now doing from around the world, from Japan to the West, what we should do is change our policy 180 degrees, stop military aid, stop providing civilizing training to Indonesian officers, as we've been doing since we told them how to carry out the coup of 1965, and insist that we certainly have plenty of economic clout to insist that Indonesia permit the right of self-determination to be exercised. It's not all that difficult.
Yes, please. One thing I would add to that, an argument often used by the State Department and also by many Democrats in Washington, is that the U.S. should not cut off its military aid to Indonesia because that aid gives the U.S. leverage to put pressure on Indonesia to improve human rights. Now, this is an interesting concept if you explore it. Imagine applying this concept to domestic criminal law. You have someone, say a Ted Bundy, who goes out and commits a mass murder. You apprehend him. You say, we're very upset with your human rights record. We have no choice but to apply leverage. Here's a pistol. And if you do it again, your aid relationship with us may be endangered. He does it again. You catch him again. You say, well, no more Mr. Nice Guy. We have no choice but to ratchet up the leverage. Here is an automatic weapon. You better not do it again, and so on. Now, in fact, that is not real. Even that does not really do justice to the nature of the relationship, because it's not as if the U.S. is applying that kind of pressure against Indonesia. If the leverage idea is truly the idea that informs the dispensation of military aid, why wasn't it tried with, say, Castro? The Soviet Union, Libya, approach Gaddafi, offer him some weapons in order to establish human rights leverage. I mean, the idea is an absurdity. It's a great reach, but it's that kind of logic and also just gross distortions of history that are used by. I mean, one thing Mr. Dinger said I agree with when he talked about a bipartisan policy over the years. That has been true. The Carter administration is in its way just as complicit as the Ford administration, and many Democrats in Congress at times have been backers of this over the years. There isn't really time now to go in detail through the State Department version of history in East Timor, but suffice to say it is completely inaccurate in every single respect. I would refer you for a more accurate account to the actual cables that were written by the CIA, by the DIA, and by the State Department during the 1974-75 period. There are hundreds of pages of them. They were leaked and published in Australia, and they establish quite a few key facts. First, the political spectrum in East Timor. There were two real parties in East Timor after the Portuguese started pulling out. Fredolin, a left party, a UDT, a right party, both wanted eventual independence. The group that wanted integration with Indonesia was a wholesale creation of Indonesian intelligence. In the words of the CIA, Apodeti had just a couple dozen members. After Suharto's generals urged him to invade Timor immediately and he wanted to hold off,
Indonesia started a covert operation instead, which included sending commando teams across the border, bombing, shelling from the sea, bombing from the air, various disruptive acts within Dili and so on. That failed to bring down the government, so they had to invade. The idea that they invaded because of a Marxist threat is also a complete nonsense. If you look at the cables, you will see that. At one point, in the summer of 1975, UDT, the right, the more conservative party, was on the verge of staging a coup. They sent their leadership to Jakarta, where they met with the Indonesian intelligence chiefs. The Indonesian intelligence people told them that, look, one thing you cannot contemplate is independence. If you try to set up a conservative UDT government and declare independence for East Timor, we will invade. You can talk to the UDT leadership. They will tell you this. It's all there documented in the record. It didn't matter to Indonesia. This would be a conservative government. What mattered to them was that this would be an independent government. And finally, in the final months leading up to the invasion, Fretilin, which by that time had become the government after a brief civil war in which, by the DIA estimate, about 400 people were killed, Fretilin had already offered to Indonesia, first, that they have a joint East Timor-Indonesia border patrol along the frontier with Western Timor. Second, that Indonesia train East Timorese military and diplomatic personnel. Third, that East Timor be allowed to join ASEAN, the military alliance. East Timor was saying to Indonesia, we want complete, we don't want to give even the inkling of any kind of threat to you. They were offering everything. And it was because East Timor was not collapsing internally that they had to invade, and they were sitting there waiting at the airport for Ford and Kissinger to give the final nod and give them permission to violate U.S. law. They gave that nod. The U.S. responded by doubling the aid, and the rest is genocide.
Mr. Dinger, would you care to reply to the questions asking, in the post-Kuwait world and post-collapse of evil empire world, why should not the United States change its tune dramatically and pressure for some form of self-determination?
I'll speak about East Timor. It's our judgment in the State Department that the basic facts remain the same in the post-Cold War world as they were in 1975-76, that Indonesia is in place, that it will not leave on its own, and that the world is not prepared to push it out, whether or not the United States is prepared to push it out. We also believe that it's useful for many reasons, including our human rights dialogue, to maintain a decent relationship with Indonesia. And so we have concluded that it would not be useful for us, it would not be useful for the East Timorese in the end. If we pushed on this issue, it would not change anything.
Yes?
Why wouldn't it change anything? I don't understand how we can support a military dictatorship that basically has been involved in human rights abuses, not only in East Timor, but in Aceh and Irian Jaya and throughout so much of Asia. And how can we reward that with sending additional military aid and M16s that are used to kill these people? I don't see how that supports our human rights dialogue. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, well, where to begin? Our military assistance to Indonesia, contrary to Mr. Nairn's statement, for this year is entirely military education and training.
Works very well.
It's interesting to note that the United Nations human rights official who was in Dili at the time of the November 12th massacre and who was looking into human rights in East Timor told us thereafter that he thought one of the most useful things that could be done to improve the human rights record of the Indonesian military is to greatly increase foreign training for them. In that international exposure helps. We think that may be the case as well. And in recent years, in fact just recently, on a broad scale, not just Indonesia specific, the United States has expanded the formal human rights component of its military education and training program, and we hope that will help more than has been the case in the past.
Okay, then how do you respond to the claims of Asia Watch's executive director, Sidney Jones, and Amnesty International, and the Australian journalist that Professor Chomsky cited, who have been arguing that post-massacre, since the massacre, that the human rights abuses in East Timor have gotten worse? I mean, how...
I'm sure it's a frustration to all of us that we don't agree on the facts. But we don't. We go to East Timor relatively often. I wish Amnesty International could go there relatively often, but they can't. Why not? Because they are seen by the Indonesian government as so biased that they won't be allowed in. I disagree with that. I disagree with that, and as I said in my statement, the United States believes that more access and openness, not less, should be the goal. But we do go there. We talk to others who go there. We talk to those who are there. We talk to all factions. We travel around. We try to get the best sense we can of what's taking place, and then we report it and we act on it. And
training. Since the invasion of Timor, the U.S. has trained more than 2,600 Indonesian officers through IMET. One of the more notable examples of U.S. training is General Benny Murdani, now the Indonesian defense minister, long very close to the U.S., a fluent English speaker, and the man who personally planned the invasion of East Timor, who personally saw to the removal of the previous Timorese archbishop, and who came into Timor 2 years ago, gathered the local Timorese elite, and gave a speech in which he told them, don't even think about independence. If you even try to think about it, we will crush you. This is General Murdani, and again, I think it's truly insulting to the Indonesians for the U.S. to be suggesting, after all these years, after all those millions and millions of dollars worth of weapons and helicopters and planes, after all those years of constant political ratification and re-ratification, that in these training sessions, the U.S. is somehow saying to the Indonesians, no, don't do what you've done up to this moment, do something else, and the Indonesians go out and disobey that U.S. training, and then the U.S. responds to that by rewarding them with still more. I mean, it's insulting both to the Indonesians and to the intelligence of the listener. Clearly, the U.S. and the Indonesian military are pursuing the same policy in East Timor.
Yes, this gentleman.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank Mr. Dinger for so eloquently reading the Assistant Secretary of State Kenneth Quinn's testimony before Congress last February. And I think that report does a very dutiful job of echoing the Indonesian's National Investigation Commission's report issued last December. And I think it has a number of very serious holes practically on every point, and I think I would ask somebody else to address those. Just one point on that before I ask my question.
No, do ask your question. We're really pressing late,
so
please get to it.
Okay, I'll skip the obvious factual error. The question I would like to ask is a question about witnesses, about testimony, about credibility of testimony. All indications, including the two tourist Australian journalists who were deported just last week, Dennis Schultz last week, and Peter Goodman, for example, this is all well after the massacre, have testified saying things like, Dili is now a city under siege. There are 10,000 troops stationed there, probably 40 in every village. This is now. Professor Anderson has alluded to Theo Chaffe's very obvious statements that the oppression and repression in East Timor have gotten quite obviously worse, and Indonesia is making no secret about that whatsoever. Their statement is a clear reversal, and there's no denying that it's a clear reversal of their previous attempt at opening up the territory. They've now gone back to a policy of divide and conquer. They've forced people to go into the hills.
Sir, you must ask your question, please.
I'm sorry. The question is, How does the U.S. State Department verify, in the face of all of this testimony, that's coming out of East Timor, what is actually happening there? Amos Wako, the UN Special Reporter on Torture, for one example, was preceded by troops. Theo Chafe went 2 miles ahead of him as he was walking along to make sure that there was no sign of dissent. He even interrupted a football match, for example, thinking that it was a political presentation. So how does, in this kind of conditions, how does the State Department intend, and how can it possibly verify that there are not continuing human rights abuses even now in East Timor? And that's my question.
The State Department does not deny that there have been human rights abuses in East Timor.
Continuing even now.
And there probably are human rights abuses that have continued since. They have not been on the scale, anything like the scale of what happened on November 12th, nor had there been in recent years prior to November 12th. That was an aberration from the trend that had been taking place for the past 2 years. How do we go about trying to figure out what's happening in East Timor? First, we visit there. We've had 5 visits there since November 12th. If our budget were larger, we'd visit there more often. But we visit there as often as we can. We've had, I think it's 10 visits in the last 2 years. That's not full-time, but that's something. There are other embassies in Jakarta that visit there too. We talk with them. We compare notes. There are Westerners, there are Indonesians in Dili, in other parts of East Timor, with whom we communicate, and we talk to them about what's happening. There are East Timorese, a number of them, with whom we communicate. When we visit, we wander the streets and talk to people.
Do you feel that you're free to wander the streets, wherever you'd like to go?
American State Department, they can wander anywhere they like. The point is that, no East Timorese with one gray cell would ever talk to anyone from the State Department, because the next thing that will happen is they'll end up in the torture chamber.
And let me comment on the idea.
That's not accurate.
I can say some personal experience about that if you're interested.
Well, just to comment on that, Governor Carrascolau and Bishop Bello both told us that that is precisely the case, and we interviewed great numbers of people who had exactly the experience, who, because they spoke to foreigners or tried to pass out information about the killings and the tortures, they were arrested. In fact, right now, one of the people who was just put on trial in Dili was charged with the crime of trying to send out to the outside world a transcript of a public interview that was given by the governor. This was considered to be subversion, leaking of classified information, and they were arrested and put on trial by the Indonesian authorities. The idea, this is a very important point, the idea that the massacre was an aberration from a positive trend is pure fantasy. We spoke to Bishop Bello before the massacre, well before the massacre. He compared the situation at that time to 1983, which, if you know the history of Timor, was a particularly grim period with several major massacres. This was when the army was convening people throughout the countryside, telling them, if you speak to the Portuguese UN delegation, you will be killed and your families will be killed to the 7th generation. And these threats were being backed up with increased assassinations and disappearances and tortures and so on. It should also be pointed out that the military people who are now facing internal military trials, although details of what they're being charged with has not been released, Amnesty testified to the Senate that the report from the Military Honor Commission indicates that it seems that the thing these soldiers are being charged with for November 12th is for being too lenient, for allowing the demonstration to take place in the first place. And the sackings of the intelligence people that have happened since the massacre have been publicly announced as being in punishment for them allowing the demonstration to take place. And let me just quote briefly from an interview from the current commander, General Sayafi, given to Compass, the Indonesian publication, on March 17. The interviewer asks, "So what attitude will the armed forces take?" And the general says, "I'll say to my troops, win over the people. The people are obliged to follow. If not," and this is what the soldiers are to say to the people, "please flee to the bush."
If they go to the bush, they then become GPK, the security disruptor gangs, and the policy on GPK is that you can shoot them on sight. He said, I'm only restoring ABRI armed forces, I'm only restoring ABRI standards. Demonstrations don't exist according to Indonesian law, and neither, I might add, do those people who engage in them.
Mr. Nairn, is that...
Sorry, I'm sorry. Did you want to say something, Mr. Dinger?
I had one short question for Mr. Nairn. I'm wondering if that's the same article in Kompas in which General Shafe gave his plans for the Indonesian military's role in East Timor in the future, in which he stated that it's his every intention to, one, reduce the number of troops there, and two, speed up the transformation of them from combat troops to civic action troops. Is that the same article?
Let's see.
Or did you fail to read that part?
I don't know if that is the same article. It is the article in which he says the crux of the matter is that in many cases we have not been decisive enough. And he has said that they want to reduce the number of troops. That's quite true. And as General Sutrisno has explained, they hope to reduce the number of troops after they have, in his word, annihilated all those who oppose the rule of Indonesia. Safi also said that it was his policy to hunt down all those who oppose Indonesia. Clearly, they would like to reduce the number of troops, but they feel they can't because the opposition among the Timorese is so persistent.
Okay. The final comment.
A quick comment. I'm oscillating between wondering if your comments, Mr. Dinger, are absolute ignorance or outright lies, and I think I won't insult you by saying they're ignorance. I just want to make two quick points. You said that one of the reasons you found the preliminary study of the Indonesians credible was that they increased the number of people. They found that more people had died in the massacre, going from 19 to 50. I will point out that when Jelani came back, the head of the investigation to Indonesia, he said he agreed with the Army estimate of 19. At that point, there was international outcry, said, this is going to be a whitewash. A week later, not having learned anything new, already having come back from East Timor the week before when he said 19, he upped it to 50, at which point the State Department said it's a credible report. Now, I want to make two quick points, and that is, we have gone around speaking around the country, and at every place we speak, the Indonesian ambassador or representative is invited. I'll use the example of Brown, where we spoke recently. In every case, the Indonesian embassy refers us either to you, Mr. Dinger, to speak, or gives us the testimony of the State Department. They feel that you represent them accurately enough that they don't have to speak. And I want to finally ask, what would it take to cut off aid? We all agree a third of the population has been killed, about 200,000 people. We all agree that more than 100 people with U.S. weapons were killed on November 12th. What would it take for the State Department to say we should cut off aid?
Do you wish to have a final comment, Mr. Dinger, to that?
First of all, I'll try to remain civil. I don't represent the Indonesian government. I represent the United States government. I represent the United States government, and I'm proud to do that. I think we have a very reasoned policy on this issue, and I'm happy to discuss it with you, but I would like it to remain a civil discussion. What does it take to cut off aid? As I understand it, American law says that if a nation is classified as a gross violator of human rights, then aid should be restricted to basic human needs deliverance. The State Department, including the Human Rights Bureau of the State Department, which looks at the broad range of human rights around the world, does not consider that Indonesia qualifies for that classification. It has never considered that, and it doesn't today. There are serious human rights problems in Indonesia. There's no doubt about that. But there are also some positive signs in Indonesia, and the response to the November 12th tragedy is one of them. The Indonesian government accepted that it was a tragedy. It accepted responsibility for it. It's going about punishing the people who took part in that tragedy. The punishment will not be because they were too lenient. It will be because they participated in a massacre.
Thank you. I am instructed by authority much too high to question that there is at least one occupation which must immediately end, and that is our occupation of the ARCO Forum. We've apparently exceeded the time available to us, and I'm afraid I have to first thank very much our panelists. I knew something about East Timor, not negligible, but I have learned a lot from this evening's discussion. I think it an extremely good one. I thank the students who put this together for performing a really very useful and important service of ventilating a vital issue. I thank you for coming, and I should remind anyone who wishes to continue to discuss this issue that informal discussion will continue in room 150 to the rear. Good night.